trying to find a time for an overnight getaway. We've all felt in different ways wearied by the work of life and parenting these last few years. And now that I live so much closer to them, it made sense to try to attempt this kind of get-together. When we first started talking about it, we had imagined traveling somewhere alluring like Napa or Palm Springs. But when we realized it was going to be difficult to plan something of that magnitude, we settled on something closer to home but no less glorious, McMinnville. Now, we were going to go and take in what has become the very quaint downtown there, maybe visit a vineyard, stay in a hotel, eat dinner at a culinary destination, and talk late into the night. And then we started figuring out when we should go, and that's where things kind of broke down. We took the calendar for the next 3 months, and we crossed off all the days that those of us who work outside the home absolutely could not miss. And most of the days that our partners who worked absolutely could not miss their jobs, since they would be taking care of the 7 children we have between us, and the likelihood at least one of those would experience an illness, childcare failure, or other disruption was pretty high. We crossed off all the holidays and birthdays and other events we knew we'd be taken up celebrating with families. Then we crossed off all the days when important things were happening in our kids' lives, basketball tournaments, martial arts, belts, tests, parent-teacher conferences. There were exactly 2 days left, so we decided those were the days that we should go. We found a cute Airbnb and planned out meals at local eateries. And then on the Sunday, before we were supposed to leave on a Thursday, I tested positive for COVID. We were all devastated. And we agonized about it, and we hemmed and hawed. Maybe I would just get better real quick. But in the end, we decided it just wasn't sensible or safe to get together, and so we canceled. Now, we tried to reschedule, but then it was the holidays, and then it was the new year, and then. Finally, about 3 weeks ago, we decided to adjust our expectations even more and to just go ahead and meet for dinner in Clackamas. We met at a chain Mexican restaurant, nothing like the farm-to-table wine dinner that we had imagined. And though it wasn't rushed, it certainly wasn't the hours and hours of conversation that we had been longing for. But you know what? It was enough. It was enough to keep us going in the meantime, as we talked and laughed and shared over nachos with queso and watered-down margaritas, as we lifted up each other with encouragement for this strange season of life when it sometimes seems there's just more life than can fit into your life. And it was enough. And I went away feeling lighter, in part because these are 2 of my closest friends in the world. We met in the early days of college, which means that they knew me before I became a mom, and before I became a minister, and before I got married. They knew me when I was still figuring out who I would be, and they've been there to see who I've been becoming for all these many years. They are the ones who have celebrated my triumphs with me, and the ones who have told me hard truths when I really needed to hear them. And especially because now there are just fewer people around in my life who knew those different parts of me from the past. And so I especially cherish their presence with me and the opportunity to be with them and in those moments to be totally myself. Do you know that feeling? And I must have had all this in mind when I looked at the text and began to think about what I wanted to say to you today, because when I read the Transfiguration story this time, I didn't even get past the first verse. That's all I needed. Something totally new hit me in the first verse, which is that this story, though it is about a lot of other things, is about Jesus going away for a little while with his friends. Did you catch that? First line, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. This is after weeks of getting followed by the crowds and teaching and healing, and they decide to go away, just the 4 of them, for a little time on the mountain by themselves. It's a retreat, isn't it? A few days away from the tumult, a trip with friends. that is not often the language that we use to describe the relationship between Jesus and his closest followers. Here in this part of the church, we call them disciples, which means something like those who follow for the purpose of learning. But when we look at the story of what happens between Jesus and those that followed him around, we have to recognize that there's more to this relationship than what transpired between you and your very inspiring 7th grade social studies teacher, right? It's a different kind of thing. These guys traveled around together for years on end. They ate together. They worked together. They healed together. They visited each other's families. They celebrated holidays together. They avoided the authorities together. They faced scary situations and reveled in good wine at weddings together. These men that are named here were the people that were with Jesus at his most powerful and also at his most vulnerable moments. Those that experienced him after his death, and those that felt compelled to carry on his legacy after he was gone. And I gotta say, to me, that sounds like a friend. In fact, that is what Jesus calls his disciples in the Gospel of John. I no longer call you servants, now I call you friends. It's also how Jesus answers the question of what true love looks like, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Now, when I started thinking about Jesus' relationship to Peter, James, and John in this light, I see something a little bit different in the Transfiguration story, this strange mystical episode with swirling clouds and voices booming out and the spontaneous cameos from Israel's Hall of Fame. I see that here in this moment, at the top of the mountain with his best friends, Jesus is being totally himself. He is revealing who he truly is. Not only the human that trudges around curing lepers and pontificating about loving your enemy, but also something more, something powerful and ancient and transcendent. Now, of course, this is something we get glimpses of previously in stories from the gospel, and the healing miracles and the stilling of the storm. But it just seems to me that this moment is when Jesus' truest identity is on display here with these friends. Which helps me to realize that maybe it may have been rather difficult for a variety of reasons to be Jesus, right? To be the conduit of the presence of God in time and space. That was a lot to manage. You know, he had to figure out how and when to deploy his spiritual power, and how and to whom to disclose his true identity, and how and where to let this aspect of his being, the divine part, to be fully expressed without freaking everyone else out, right? In a way, it's the journey of being yourself with your friends. And here in this moment, it's a glimpse of who he truly is, one that Jesus is brave to share. They go up the mountain together, and Jesus opens up himself, and the others truly see, even the hard parts. And when it's all over, he says, hey, don't be afraid. And maybe we hear it like this, don't be afraid. It's just me. And it's a big moment. It's a big moment in the Gospels. There's a reason we hear this story every single year. It's a foretaste of the resurrection, of what will happen when Jesus transitions from his mortal existence. And it's also a huge moment for the disciples, because there's a sense that in this story, that this moment lays the groundwork for them to be able to believe in the resurrection, because they've seen and known this part of Jesus that they hadn't known before. Which reminds me that we've been talking about what to do when we feel the spiritual blues come on, in the winter time or any other time. And certainly one of those things, one of those practices that turns a lamp on inside our soul is being with friends, with the people who know us best and who love us for who we truly are. Certainly one of those practices is finding those pockets where we can be ourselves and letting ourselves shine within them. Now, of course, I want to acknowledge this can be easier said than done due to a number of factors. Maybe the chapter of life we are presently in makes it difficult to connect with friends. if our responsibilities are too many, or our resources, emotional or otherwise, too few. Maybe we don't find connecting to be that easy, and it takes a lot of oomph to get us out of the door or to pick up that phone. Maybe we feel that we just don't have those types of friends in this season of our life. I know I've spent several seasons of life when I just didn't feel as though I had many friends close at hand, and I didn't have the emotional fortitude or many opportunities, for that matter, to make new ones. And it was terribly discouraging. And if that describes somewhere you find yourself, then take comfort in knowing that you are not the only one. Perhaps you have read that America has been undergoing an epidemic of loneliness in the past decade. This is something that researchers were noticing before the pandemic, but which the circumstances of COVID dramatically accelerated. As you may be able to track in your own life, starting in 2020, many of us, even those who initially mourned the isolation from loved one, we just eventually became more accustomed to spending time on our own. We got used to having distance, and it continues now. But it actually didn't start with COVID. Census data tells us that Americans are spending less and less time with friends every year, and that general loneliness has been consistently on the rise since the 1970s. In fact, a recent study by Harvard University found that about 36% of Americans experience serious loneliness on a regular basis, 36%. Just in case you're interested, that number's closer to 55% of moms of young children. But the scariest part of that study to me is the part that says among young adults, that number is more than 60%. That's 2 in 3 adolescents in our communities who are experiencing serious loneliness on a regular basis. Adolescents who are likely to say that no one spent more than a few minutes making them feel genuinely cared for this week. Surely, that is part of the rising rates of anxiety and depression in that age group. But the truth is, it's not just them. It's not really good for any of us, no matter what age you are. The current Surgeon General has identified that the health risks of loneliness are extreme, raising one's probability of getting heart disease, dementia, and stroke. In fact, some studies have shown that the long-term effect of loneliness on longevity is approximately equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We've been subject to ads about why tobacco is bad for us for 50 years, but I haven't yet seen one about social cohesion, right? And a response to something that is an epidemic in our community. And all this is to say, we've got to find some new ways to invest in friendship as a health practice and certainly as a spiritual discipline. And I know it's hard, and sometimes we don't know where to begin. But friendship is good for our bodies, and I think what I learned from the story about the transfiguration, that it's good for our souls too. Because being with people with whom we can be totally ourselves, people who love us for who we are, warts and all, those experiences connect us to God. Because it was God who loved us first, before we even were who we were, and who will love us, continue to love us, long after this life is through. I think that's the message inherent in the incarnation, that in Jesus, God came to be our friend and to walk with us as only a friend does. And so when we spend time with our human friends, we reinforce that good news. Now, I also hear, maybe you are thinking about lunch plans or setting up a walk in your mind later for this week. Hearing this, I think that's great. I hear in this set of circumstances certainly a call to personal devotional practice, spending time with loved ones. But I also hear in it a call to communal action, to ministry as a church. Because in the face of a culture that is literally dying of loneliness, what is the church to be if not a nurse deploying the medicine of friendship to our neighbors? You know, interestingly, This is something that came through really strongly in our recent mission study. You thought we forgot about that. That was like 6 months ago. It's still there. We're still working on thinking about how those findings can drive the life of our church. But one thing that we found was that we really appreciate relating to each other here at Rose City Park Presbyterian Church, to connecting and getting to know each other and forming bonds. But what also came out was that we need some new ways to do that, some new and fresh ways to keep integrating new folks into our friendship circles. And we're not alone in this. You know, the church of the 20th century was actually really good at helping people build bonds of friendship at church. There were lots of programming for youth and parents and families, opportunities to get together regularly outside of Sunday worship and to build long-term friendships. And we can see that in some of the friendships that exist here today in this church, folks that connected to that time and are still around. But we also have to acknowledge that life in the 21st century has become so much more cosmopolitan. Church members don't always live within close proximity to the church buildings where they attend. We all work on different schedules with our children in different schools. We are more likely to move away from our communities of origin and start over in new places. And so the rhythms of those programs that were meant to regularly engage us may not work for all of us anymore. So we're going to need to think creatively about what might, in fact, bond us together and keep us uplifted. Keep us connected to the God who also sees us as we are and loves us in that way. I think another challenge is that we tend to get a little bit laser focused on the work of the church rather than the relationships that make up the church. I should say I am guilty of this as a very type A person. I'm like, let's get the job done. Let's not be socializing all the time in this meeting. I would never think that about you. Previous churches I've served, I've thought that in the past, not here. I think we'll take time to connect with each other when we're done with the committee meeting, the lawn mowing, the worship service, the financial audit. But really, I think what the Transfiguration points to and what the research underscores is that perhaps friendship is itself a task as worthy of our attention as anything else. Maybe you are familiar with Catholic priest and scholar of Celtic spirituality, John O'Donohue. He believed that the development of spiritual friendships was among the most important tasks of the church. In his popular book, Anam Cara, which is Celtic for soul friend, he talks about the work of developing soul friendships, spiritual bond in which one's true self can be welcomed. Within this kind of friendship, O'Donohue wrote, you can become awakened to your most true God-given identity and understand most fully the contours of your own spirit. It is this kind of love, he writes, that allows a friend to hold up a mirror to your soul, that you might best understand who you are, and, in O'Donohue's words, awaken to the wild possibilities within you. I have to wonder what it would be like if we set an intention of developing soul friendships right here in this church. If we set that as our purpose, how would we fit that in? How would we begin? How would it change the way we worship and pray and fellowship and have meetings? I don't know, but I think I should say it's okay if we start small. A walk, a lunch with someone new or old. It doesn't have to be days alone on a mountaintop. Sometimes it can be tortilla chips and a laugh. But my encouragement to you today is to find some places where the whole real you is welcome. To think about where those are and with whom they exist. And going forward from here to prioritize being in those places. If you find yourself thinking that there are none, to reach out, if they don't exist for you yet, to someone in this community and say, hey, I could really use a friend. My encouragement for us all, for this whole body, is also to be thinking about how we can start to build and to carve out some of those places here. And to trust that it might be the beginning of a road that ultimately leads to resurrection and to more life than any of us could have imagined. So I offer those words and that invitation in the name of the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.